Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today. We are very excited to have this exclusive virtual Q&A today with 4 great journalists, which we will be welcoming very soon. And just to give you a bit of background before we start the Q&A, this year at Inkline, we had the opportunity to do a year-long project around the climate crisis and looking at what solutions are there around the world to mitigate it. And so we asked lots of different journalists to pitch their ideas because we wanted to have stories from every continent. And so thanks to the support of the Solutions Journalism Network, we were able to then get 6 stories published this year. And so 4 of the journalists who published these stories are now going to join us on the stage. And so tonight we have with us Inbar, we have Nithin, we have Laura, and we also have Mikki. So I can't wait to start the Q&A. I'm going to ask each of you to quickly introduce yourselves. So maybe Inbar, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. So I'm Inbar Preiss. I'm an editor and a journalist originally from Israel, but now I'm based in Brussels, and I've been working on various journalistic projects in the fields of identity, culture, politics, conflict. So I'm studying international politics at the moment and continuing to write and work on different projects.
Amazing. Laura, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for having us. Hi, my name is Laura. I'm from Germany originally, but I've lived in Mexico City for the last 3 years. I'm a freelance journalist, an author, and also a blogger and an urban planner. So I usually focus on urban planning stories, also city, as you'll see.
Awesome. Amazing. Nithin, do you want to go next?
Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm Nithin Coca. I'm a freelance journalist from the United States, but usually based in either Japan or Indonesia, focusing on environmental issues, climate, energy, but also human rights, and really like to take a solutions journalistic approach to try to foster a community and try to bring different perspectives to very difficult stories and issues. So happy to be here.
Amazing. Yeah, and then finally we also have Mikki. Mikki, it's quite late at night for you, so we really appreciate that you made it tonight.
Hi, sorry, the connection's a bit hard here. I'm Mikki. I'm a freelance Australian journalist. I just moved back to Australia a couple of years ago now after living in London and New York for some time. And I focus on climate and science and features for global publications as well as Australia-based ones.
So it's quite amazing to see, the diversity of the panel today and the type of background that you all have. And to get us started, I thought it would be quite nice to start by asking you, how did you go about finding your story and pitching it to us initially when you started? And maybe, Nithin, do you want to start?
Sure. So actually, it was a pretty long journey for me. I was in Indonesia in 2015 when they had these historic forest fires that burned over 2 million hectares and were one of the largest climate pollution events in recent history. I think the fires that year put as much CO2 in the atmosphere as Germany does in an entire year. And when I was there, in the aftermath of the fire, it was such a big event. There was a lot of these efforts to restore peatlands, to stop deforestation, etc. And I was doing stories on that, but one of the things that kept coming up was like, we can't actually assess how effective these measures are until there's another El Nino, because one of the reasons the 2015 fires were so bad is because it was an El Nino year. So when 2019 came around, and in the beginning of the year, I saw projection that this was going to be another El Nino. I was like, great, this is an opportunity to finally see like how effective these measures have been in Indonesia. And that's kind of where the story idea came from, just like realizing that there was an opportunity to critically look back at some of these things for the first time in 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can say as well from the editor perspective, for us, what we really liked about your story was the fact that peatland is not very often covered as an ecosystem. So we thought that was really interesting when you came up with that story specifically.
Yeah, it was a learning process for me too, so I didn't know much about it 5 years ago. So
definitely an interesting ecosystem. Maybe Inbar, do you want to go next?
Sure. For me, the story came from my background, which I previously was working as a reporter on the blockchain and cryptocurrency industry. And this brought me to a lot of interesting places and conferences around Europe. And one of the most interesting places that cryptocurrency reporting brought me to was an organization called Parallel Nicolis in Prague. And this is an organization which uses technological tools, and they advocate for privacy and freedom with tools like cryptocurrencies, but also many others. And they have a very interesting, uniquely Eastern European take on crypto anarchy and other philosophies which can also be controversial, like libertarianism, but essentially they're deeply rooted in crypto anarchy and cypherpunk philosophy. And one of their projects was Parallel Gardens, which is a project which uses scalability and these different technological advancements to provide for sustainable agriculture and an alternative to mainstream agriculture, which is very much degraded in Prague and in Czech Republic.
Yeah, and again here from the perspective of the editor, I have to say when we read your pitch, we were just like, this is so interesting. Like that's something that we had never ever heard of. And like for me, being in the environmental sector myself, I always had that vision that cryptocurrency was something that wasn't meant to be really good for the environment. So that was such an interesting take on that industry and how you went through the story. It was really interesting. Definitely quite a read for us. We were like, oh, that's all new. So that was brilliant.
Yeah, it's definitely a very unique story. Sorry.
Yeah, it was really unique for sure. When we saw it, we were like, this is not something we've ever read before. Mikki, would you like to go next? I think you might be on mute, Mikki. We might just be having some technical problem. Laura, do you want to go next instead?
Yeah, of course, I can go ahead. So in my case, I arrived in Mexico City kind of as an urban planner, and I was still trying to wrap my head around the whole urban planning situation in Mexico, which, as you can imagine, in a metropolis of like 23 million people, possibly, maybe more, maybe less, no one knows. It was really hard. A conference on disaster and risk communication, which is actually not my main topic, but I found it really interesting, and I applied to be part of one of the workshops they were doing. And part of the workshop was a field trip. So we looked into disasters in Mexico City, which apart from earthquakes are also floodings induced by very heavy rains. And we took a field trip to this kind of poor community that I wrote the article about as well. And initially I wrote an article for my blog, and then I realized it was one of my most popular articles. So I also pitched it to several journalistic outlets, and then I gave it this solutions spin inspired by the Solutions Journalism Network. And that's how I ended up with Inkline in the end.
Amazing. And I think we really enjoyed the fact that it was so embedded within the community and just looking at what different people were doing. And again, that's a problem that is because climate change is impacting so many different places in similar ways. So I think there's definitely a lot to learn for other places looking at what the response in Mexico is like. Oh, I can see that Mikki, you're back. Do you want to go next, Mikki? I think the technology is not on our side. I can't hear you, Mikki. It says you're on mute. Do you want to try to unmute again and see if that works?
I can't hear you guys. It keeps on dropping out. I'm so sorry.
We can hear you though, if you want to tell us a bit more about your story. Okay, I think we might need to then move on, unfortunately. Okay. So thank you all so much for answering that first question. And I think it's really interesting to see, again, like the kind of topics that you picked. And for us at Inkline, when we reviewed all the pitches, it was really interesting seeing the way that people approach the climate crisis and the potential solutions. And so now I wanted to ask each of you more personalized questions about your specific story. And I wanted to start with you, Inbar. So your story focuses very much on technology and looking into the future and how that can be used to mitigate the climate crisis. So can you tell me a bit more about why you decided to pick that specific topic, and how do you think that can be also adapted then to other countries?
Yeah, I think there was quite a few elements in this story that were very much linked to the climate crisis and solutions angles. First of all, the fact that it's focused on food production. This initiative is focused on agriculture and the sustainability of agriculture, which in times of intensifying climate change and increasing global populations is becoming more and more relevant. Secondly, there's the issue of scalability, which Parallel Gardens is very much working on. So that means that organizations can make their mistakes and go through the learning process on a small scale, and only when they're ready to maybe feed a larger population and they see that everything's working out, then can they scale up rather than invest tons and tons of money into a very complex process, which might not even be sufficient. And then it's also very much community oriented. So the more people are taking part and trying out the technologies and trying out this hydroponic or closed circuit way of agriculture, the stronger the open source information becomes. And I think open source makes it also very valuable to a global community, because the fact that the best practices and all the information is available publicly for everyone means that everyone can try it out and everyone can add their own input and their own value to the agricultural process. Maybe to explain a little bit more background, what Parallel Gardens do is they build hydroponic crop kind of agriculture, and they also use cryptocurrency mining processes, which is heavy computers which use a lot of energy and produce a lot of subsidual heat. So they use that heat to feed into a greenhouse. And this is not a complete project. They're very much still in the starting phase, but it's a large community which helps them build it up slowly. Another point is that cryptocurrencies are becoming increasingly relevant. I think it's not just Bitcoin that is rising, but a lot of nations are investing in having their own digital currencies. And I think that the technologies that are developing around this are going to become more and more relevant, and we're going to have to learn how to work with the energy consumption that they're using. And this project kind of maybe not necessarily mitigates this energy, but it makes use of it. So in a way, it balances out the wastefulness. So yes, these are the different elements that I could think of.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting, actually, that kind of like learning from your mistake, learning from what might work or what might not work, and going from there. I think that's something that I thought was definitely very scalable in your story. So that element was what definitely resonated with us in terms of what makes a solution story as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mikki, can you hear us now?
Oh, sorry. I can hear you the best, Julia,
Yay.
but only a little bit. I'm so sorry.
No worries. Do you want to tell us a bit more about your story and how you went about finding it and pitching it?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I've lived all around the world, and I've recently moved back to my hometown of Perth in Western Australia. And my brother lives up in Broome, which is in the far north of Western Australia. We're a very big state of nothingness. And so it's quite a remote part of town, quite expensive to get to, quite hard to get to. And just on my visits up to meet him, I would meet Indigenous people up there, and I knew that I'd done a story for the BBC Future Planet on climate control down in Manjimup, which is down south. And I just knew that when you're looking for climate stories, it's usually where you can go that you'll find something. So just with a bit of internet research, I found some really good research papers on what some of the Indigenous people were doing up there to mitigate climate control. The way that they're caring for the country and looking after the land was pretty amazing. And then they invited me to go down to the remote community, and that was in the midst of the pandemic, so it was quite hard to get into because they'd shut off to everybody. But because we've been very safe here, I think we're 270 days COVID free.
Wow.
Invited me down, and then after spending 2 days in the region, was able to nut out that the story was more even about fire management, whereas originally I thought it was going to be management and whatnot. The way that fire through controlled burning was pretty groundbreaking for me when I was up there. Did you want me to keep?
And actually, it's really interesting that you're talking. Oh, sorry. I was about to say it's interesting to have you straight after Inbar, because in one case, Inbar was kind of looking at technology and the future, and I felt with your story, it's something that we noticed with the pitches we received. It's more looking towards the past and seeing what kind of Indigenous practices and knowledge are also, there to help us mitigate the climate crisis. So could you tell us a bit more about why you decided to focus on that specific topic of Indigenous knowledge, and how, what can other countries learn from what you've been finding?
It's just breaking up a little bit again. But basically, looking back, so the Indigenous people have lived on our land, on their land for thousands of years. And so they've survived ice ages and climate crises all around. One of the big takeaways that they were saying is that in Western society, on calendar, there's indicators and signs. And so they have 7 seasons, or in this part of Australia have 7 different seasons, but by focusing on indicators, that was a more appropriate way of recording the climate and the changes, because they might know it's summer because the dragonflies have come, but we think it's summer in our time zone, December 1. So just their relationship with the land, I thought that that's just something that we need to harness, because that's where the climate is coming from. So part of the dream time, and I'm better at writing than I am at speaking sometimes, but is the kinship with the land, and it's a very holistic relationship that goes round and round. And I think that's something that in this day and age we could go back to and focus on that relationship with the land to get a better solution on how to fix the climate or help the climate. And then with the Indigenous fire management, they're burn extra bits of fuel, and when the fires do come, there's less to burn, and it's better for biodiversity, it's better for the animals. And in the eastern states, they were ravished by fires at the start of the year because they don't have that kind of practice. So if the eastern states of Australia had gone back to the Indigenous fire management, they would not have experienced such hardship with the fires that they did at the start of the year. I think it's, I don't know where the stat is, but it's something like 40% less fire damage is happening in this side due to the Indigenous fire management.
Yeah, that was definitely like a fascinating topic, and we had another journalist as well writing about Indigenous practices in Chile as well. So if you're watching us right now, you can find all these stories on the website. And I just wanted to say as well, I haven't said it at the beginning, but please send us your questions if you have any, because we'll take some at the end. I just wanted to go back to you, Nithin, and as I said earlier, you worked on an ecosystem that is often overlooked. And we really like the fact that what you were explaining in your story was very scalable and adapted to other countries which might have peatlands. How did you approach the story to emphasize the scalability of your solution? Because I thought that was something that you did really well in your story.
Yeah, thank you. I think, to be honest, is a bit based on my cynicism, because as a journalist, I would get so many pitches from companies and nonprofits that would emphasize, like, we've created this tool that'll solve problem X. But when you looked at it, the thing they were always never thinking about was scalability. And scalability it's not just, you know, making a tool that can work everywhere. It's like, how do you work with local communities to make sure that are actually living alongside peatlands? I mean, peatlands are incredibly important because they, you know, they regulate water systems. They hold immense amounts of carbon stock. I think more than 40% of all the soil carbon in the world is in these peatland areas, and they're really not that well understood. I think one of the big surprises in 2015, when we had these humongous peatland fires in Southeast Asia, was just how little science there was about peatlands. They had not been really well researched, so they were not very well understood. How can you create a solution to a problem that's not even understood? So in my reporting, I was really interested, and over the last 5 years, I was always paying attention to what is the latest scientific research about peatlands. What is it saying about the scale of these types of soil, these types of land? Where do they exist? We didn't even know where they exist. We still don't really know where they exist because there hasn't been accurate mapping done around the world. So I guess for me, like, it's a double challenge. So you're trying to like write a piece about these really important lands that are not that well understood, but you're also trying to like figure out like what are the solutions that we can work on right now. So I just try to focus on like what has emerged over the last 5 years. It was interesting that every time a new scientific study came out, it kind of proved that peatlands are more important than we thought. That there's actually more. They're more important to ecosystems. They're more important to soil carbon, climate change, etc. That actually, like, the more we learned about it, the more important it was to protect them. And in Indonesia, where these fires happened in 2015, there had been so many initiatives set up in 2016 that it was just really interesting to see, like, what were the lessons that people got. The fact that they were science-driven was great because these scientists who are willing to, you know, they were not just trying to promote bad solutions or promote their kind of technologies. They were trying to actually understand these systems, and I thought there were a lot of parallels to challenges in different parts of the world. So I think just creating that space for discussion and debate in a story and connecting different issues together can spur, you know, a lot of scientific exchange and knowledge that can hopefully help address these challenges at scale. So it's a really difficult. It's a story that's evolving every year. But I think last year was an interesting point to kind of look at it and show what's going on and try to give a snapshot of like a very important, fascinating sector, focusing on a country where there's been a lot of amazing progress over 5 years, and what can that mean for the world?
For sure, and it really made into a fascinating read. So thank you so much for pitching your story to us. Laura, I said earlier that one thing that I really enjoyed about your story was how the community was at the heart of it. And that's something that we've really seen through actually the 6 stories that we published this year. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you went about finding all the different voices, bringing the community at the center of the story.
Yes, of course. So I think first of all, it's so important to actually go there and be on the ground and ideally speak the language. In my case, it was absolutely necessary because I talked to a lot of people who might not, you know, have had any advanced education. They wouldn't speak any English at all. So you have to be able to speak the language, and you have to be able to adapt your language as well. Because if you come in and you ask very complicated climate change questions, that's not going to help. So you have to have a good idea of the local culture and, you know, what everyday life might be like for these people. And then you kind of try and understand the situations. And then what I did after this field trip, where we got to visit a few different people and a few different of these solutions that they have in this particular community in Mexico City to flooding and other climate change challenges, but flooding in particular. Yeah. I did some follow-up interviews, and I think there it's really crucial to, again, adapt to what local people might do or might like. So in the case of Mexico, that's using memes, staying in touch via WhatsApp, and even doing an interview via WhatsApp. They love WhatsApp in this case. I mean, it might be other messaging tools, it might be other ways of communication, but I think it's really key to offer them a good, you know, like a low threshold of communicating with you as a journalist, because they might be a little bit intimidated, or they might not know what this is all about. They might not understand what Inkline is or whatever outlet you're pitching to. I think it's really important to try and make it as plausible as possible. And then, of course, in the end, share the article as well and share some of the results so that the people you interviewed really understand, you know, what's happening with my answers, who gets to read this. I've learned in Mexico in particular that there's a lot of interest in having articles about community projects that appear in English language magazines or online platforms, because that's something they crave, this kind of international attention, and they're really proud of some of their solutions, but they usually don't have a way of sharing that. Maybe with Mexican, like Spanish language newspapers, but that's usually a smaller readership, and they really want this international exposure, but then you have to go about it very, very delicately and with a lot of empathy, and you have to bring time. I think a lot of time was key as well, because people are going to invite you to eat with them and to sit down and to talk about their grandchildren and all of that. So first of all, you have to establish this kind of base of a lot of trust and, you know, some mentoring, maybe some jokes and some, showing a lot of interest. That's something I've learned, but I think I was only able to write this article because I spent 3 years in Mexico. So you really have to know the people you write about if it's not your own culture in particular. And then also Mikki said something like she's better at writing than at speaking. I think that applies to me as well. Sometimes I'm actually an introvert, but that helps a lot in these situations because you just need to get the people to talk, right? Your interviewees. And then they're so happy to have someone to listen to them. And especially, I think, someone who's kind of maybe from a different country, and that you bring this international interest and they know they're going to be on some platform. That helped a lot. And then, but mostly also time, bringing a lot of time and patience to the process.
Yeah, I think you're making a lot of really good points. So I thought I remember when I read your story, thinking about, knowing your audience, like sometimes people come up with fancy solutions to mitigate the climate crisis, but they're just not adapted at all to the audience or the people who live in these places. And so then it just ends up falling completely flat because people won't use the method. So I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned in your story, using WhatsApp or like using what people actually use, I thought was really powerful. And when you mentioned as well that you've been embedded within that community, that's actually something that when we started the project, that was something that was really important to us as editors as well. We really wanted to try to have journalists who were based in these places or who had lived in these places for a while, so that they could really report from that perspective and not just be, doing phone interviews or not really knowing the context. And we felt that with these 6 stories, it made quite a difference to have people who were really embedded within these places. I think we have lost Mikki, but I'm going to keep going. I think the next question I have for you is, so for all of you, it's the same question, but I was wondering if you could tell me a bit what your key takeaway working on these solution stories about the climate crisis were, and also if you have any tips for journalists who are keen to cover the climate crisis in a more solutions-based way. Maybe Inbar, do you want to go first?
Yes, sure. It's a good question. I think solutions journalism is basically the most fundamentally writing or reporting as a focus on the responses rather than the problem itself. So that is, I think, a formula that can help journalists and myself report better on solutions. And the other aspect is to embrace the complexity of the solutions. I think it's important to know that there's no perfect solution to anything, and you can't just copy paste one solution from one place to another. There's different perspectives and different implications each time. But I do think that that it shows the resilience and the creativity of humanity every time, and the biggest benefit is to hope to inspire other communities or show different approaches that are working and see how they can be implemented or adopted.
Yeah, I think embracing the complexity is definitely one that we hear very often, and I think it's kind of a core part of solutions journalism, and it's something that is way harder than it looks to actually implement. So I think it's a very interesting one when it comes to the climate crisis, because it's such a massive topic as well, and it's so hard to kind of wrap our brain around the complexity of it. Nithin, do you want to go next?
Yes. So yeah, key takeaway, like there was no way I could have reported the story without my experiences having been in Indonesia and reported on deforestation forest issues since 2015. And like when I first went there in 2015, I was going there to kind of wanted to cover deforestation, but the fires happened right when I got there and all my plans got destroyed. And it's been like a common pattern. Like when you do field reporting, you can make all the plans you want, but a lot of times like your experience on the ground is going to kind of shape the way your reporting goes. And you have to be flexible, you have to be willing to listen. And I think of taking a solutions journalism approach is really important. In Indonesia, it's a country that has a lot of environmental problems. It's very easy to just write the same critical negative story again and again about how terrible things are. But if you take a solutions approach and you actually talk to people on the ground, talk to the local communities you're meeting or scientific experts and ask them like kind of what can be changed or what are some areas where things are going well, just embed that into your questions and the way you report, you'll actually find there's like, oh, there's interesting things I wouldn't have discussed if I just focused on deforestation and fires, that actually I can also write a story about this. And it's good to highlight that there's everywhere in the world, no matter how bad things are, there's people who are trying to make a difference and are succeeding in making a difference. And the only way to kind of find those stories is by having that approach from the very beginning embedded into the way you report. So yeah, I just think, so I guess the two things, like be flexible and let your situation on the ground or the people you talk to lead your reporting. And secondly, be sure to always bring that solutions approach even to a story that doesn't necessarily seem like it has it, because it can illuminate and show you a different way and a different perspective and a different angle that can enrich your reporting.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I was asked recently at a conference, how to find a positive spin on story, or how to find the solutions. And I was saying that actually once you start doing it, I feel like then it's a bit of a framing mindset, and you start seeing solutions everywhere, because your brain then just goes like, okay, here's the problem, but surely someone is trying to resolve it in some ways, and then you start finding all these new stories.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just a small switch in how you think and how you report.
Exactly. Yeah, that's how we describe it as well. What about you, Laura?
One of my recommendations would be to always look for more unconventional solutions as well. And someone recently gave me the tip of looking for little anecdotes that are the ones that you would tell your family at night once you're having dinner together. So something fun, like for example, or for my case, it would be like a street art festival that might help to solve the problem of flooding and other climate change induced challenges in Mexico City. Like, how can a street art festival help? It's not an immediate connection, but it might be a fun story. Plus, it's also more fun for you as a journalist to look into these kind of unconventional solutions that will stick in the minds of the readers as well. So I think that's really important. And then always ideally ending the story on the question of scalability, or kind of what's the takeaway for the reader and what's the takeaway for people who might have similar challenges. Like, how can they scale the solution? And I'm always asking my interviewees as well, because it might be a very particular solution that's tailored to Mexico City, let's say. But they usually have some great ideas on how this could apply to other communities, or they might even know other communities who apply the same solutions. And that already gives you some more research input on how to look into scalability as well.
Well, I think we have some questions. So actually, one question is, are there any specific questions that you ask your interviewees when you're working on a solution story to kind of get that narrative going? I don't know who wants to go first, whoever feels inspired by that question. Inbar, maybe, do you want to try to answer that one?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking, because I think it really depends on the story. I'm trying to think of a more general question that you can apply to different scenarios which are solutions driven. But I think depending if it's perhaps climate approach, it's focusing on responses. So seeing, asking communities what is being done about certain issues, and that really evolves a conversation towards the solution and towards the responses, and what are the, I always ask what the limitations of the solutions are, so that we're not faced with just a positive feel-good story, but something that is a bit deeper and can really show the complexities of different responses and the solutions. So I think, what are the limitations of a certain solution, and how are they being overcome? So both sides. So really bringing it full circles of the solution, limitation of the solution, and then how do you overcome the limitation to the solution? So yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something really important here. That is, if people go and read your stories, they realize that there's also a lot of data, just trying to assess how successful these different methods are. For all of your stories, you've had that background as well of being like, here is the stats for for a specific project, or here is why I have proof that it's working. And I think that's really important. Was there any other questions, Nithin and Laura, that you would say you also asked your interviewees?
Yeah, one thing that just came to mind is that I think it's really interesting to always ask like how things used to be. So always like, if I go to a farming region, how was the situation here 30 years ago? How was it 20 years ago? What's changed since then? Like, do you have, and I think you can find, that's a good way to get people to tell different stories, and then kind of understanding the changes over time can also kind of help you understand the problems, but understand like why these communities made the decisions they made. And then maybe it's not directly going to lead to, you know, I think it helps you kind of better understand the present situation if you understand the past, and then you can kind of better understand how solutions could actually affect this community, or how different projects or different initiatives can affect the community. So I think that's, it's an indirect way of getting some interesting kind of potential solutions, answers or kind of thoughts.
That makes sense. Yeah, looking at the evolution, I think, is really important. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Laura?
Yes, I also asked them about the future. I would ask, like, where do you see your community in 5 years, or what do you think is going to happen to your specific solution over the next year or 5 years, something like that. And then I would also add to what Inbar said, trying to ask the same question of as many different stakeholders as possible, because they might have very, very different replies to potential limitations to a solution, for example. It's usually one of the most interesting parts of the reporting, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm just going to look at my screen because I think we have another question. This question is specifically for Nithin. How do you think can the conversation around peatlands be talked about more? Because as we said, it's an ecosystem that is not very covered. So how do you think that we can get a bit more coverage for that specific ecosystem?
I think one way is maybe recognizing how close probably most of us live to peatlands somewhere. So I don't think we realize like exactly, you know, I didn't realize like the bogs in Northern Europe and a lot of different wetlands I see in California are peatlands also. They're different than tropical peatlands, but I think we need to it'd be good to realize like actually these lands, these types of ecosystems are in our backyards, and maybe better identifying them, just like using the word peatland. Peatland kind of is a new term that's been created to kind of bring all these different landscapes together. And I think it's the first step towards kind of increasing the opportunity, increasing the space for people to talk about it more and kind of understand how they connect, how your local peatland, what you call the swamp, but is actually also a peatland, or what you call the bog, which is actually a peatland, how it connects with this global network of peatlands. And then there's these interesting initiatives like the Global Peatlands Initiative or Peatland Research Institute that are trying to actually figure out like the role of these lands play in ecosystems. I think it's where tropical forests discussion was like 10, 15 years ago. Peatlands is still kind of in infancy, but I do see the discussion going. And I think for journalists around the world, like maybe find where your local peatland is, see how well of a shape it is in, and what are the challenges it's facing, and are there people trying to preserve that peatland? Maybe that's a way to help bring local discussion and then connect it to Indonesia or Europe or Latin America.
It's really interesting, as actually it really depends on your personal context, because for me, I know that initially, if I think of peatlands, I'll think of like Scotland or like something really rainy and cold. And then you start realizing that actually you have other types of peatlands all over the place. So yeah, it's a really good point. I think we have a question specifically for, actually this one is for all of you. Did any of you, I'm losing my voice. Did any of you have to interact with policymakers as a part of your solution piece? And if so, how difficult or easy was that?
In my case, I wanted to interact with policymakers and it was not really possible. So it can just be a very big challenge, particularly in countries which struggle with corruption, like Mexico, to even get in touch with them or to ask any critical questions. And honestly, if you don't know someone in these situations, I think it's really, really hard to get to a point. I mean, I'm sorry, that's not really a solution or any recommendation, just to maybe be aware that sometimes it can be very, very hard.
Yeah. Is that something that you experience as well, Nithin and Inbar?
Yeah, it's very similar. Like, especially if I look at like Indonesian policymakers in the country, the national level ones is really difficult to speak to. I would say like, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go into the field for this reporting. But in the previous times I've been to the field, if I try to find local officials like village leaders, they can sometimes be more accessible, or local government officials. But I found when I'm writing about environmental issues, they're awfully not very knowledgeable about it, which is also, I mean, that's part of that's interesting to know that they don't know much about what's going on, or they don't care much about fires or deforestation or peatlands. But yeah, it's really difficult in Indonesia to get national people to speak to foreign journalists.
Yeah, I can imagine. Inbar, did you have any reaction to that specific question?
Well, my story was very specifically anti-policy kind of approach, where the community is just going ahead and creating a parallel approach to agriculture and just doing their own thing while ignoring whatever the state is doing. So that because they're so critical of the state of agriculture nationally, that they would rather just build alternative solutions that are not to do with the state. So I think my article, maybe for a different angle or for a more holistic approach, I would have had to talk to policymakers, but that's not what I ended up doing in this story.
Yeah, no, that's now that you're saying it, yeah, it's very true that the focus is very different in your story, and that's what was really interesting as well. I think we've got one more question for Laura, and then we'll probably be wrapping up. So someone asked if there were any other climate change solutions in Mexico City that you wanted to include but didn't get a chance to in your article. And if so, how did you decide the ones to include in?
Oh, that's a great question. There are a lot of other climate change solutions in Mexico City overall, but in this particular community that is struggling particularly with flooding during the rainy season, so about 2 or 3 months a year, that's all the solutions I could find. So I focused on these, and for the piece itself, I think it was structured into 3 different solutions. That's also, in terms of a structure, it's nice, because the reader gets guided very well. But then if the person who's asking is interested in other climate change solutions from Mexico City, feel free to get in touch. I know of a lot of them. I could write a lot of other articles about them. Mexico City is doing pretty well, or at least attempting a lot, because they've got a great mayor, in my opinion, a woman who's a climate scientist. She's got a PhD in this area, and she's been in office for almost 2 years now, and she's doing her best. And obviously there's a lot of hurdles and there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of green infrastructure, and they're trying bit by bit to change a lot of things. So I'd be happy to speak more about that. I could give a whole talk about this. But for this piece, I focused. Yeah, for this piece, I focused on the ones that the community themselves are able to implement.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much all for taking the time to take part in this Q&A. I know we had quite a wide range of time zones, so we made it. And apologies everyone that we lost Mikki on the way, but hopefully if you have any questions specifically for Mikki about our story, you can just ask in the comments and she can get back to you. Do you have any last word before we wrap up this session? No, I think we're probably all good then. Well, thank you so much for taking part, and I think that's it for today.
Thank you so much for this whole project and for the opportunity. I've definitely learned a lot about solutions journalism through this story, and thanks for Laura, Nithin, and Mikki for also sharing their experiences.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.